This is the Keys to the Shop Rate of Rise series brought to you by Roast Magazine. Today we're talking about buying less and doing more with Meister. Well, hey everybody, this is Chris DiFirio with Keys to the Shop. Welcome to Rate of Rise, elevated conversations on roasting brought to you by Roast Magazine. Roast Magazine is one of the longest running and most respected trade journals in the coffee industry, and they have launched a new series called Roast Audio Articles that presents articles from Roast Magazine's archives covering coffee from a technical perspective, so you can keep up with the latest research, knowledge, and insights from scientists, subject matter experts, and professionals from across the industry. You can go to roastmagazine.com/audio articles to peruse episodes via your web browser or listen and subscribe on SoundCloud to access new issues as they are released. Again, that is roastmagazine.com/audio articles. Well, I'm really excited to have you along today on this Rate of Rise episode. This is number 6 in the series that we started earlier this year. I'm really enjoying these conversations and learning a ton about roasting and all that goes into creating amazing coffee. Today, we are going to be talking with Meister about an article that she wrote about buying less and doing more related to green buying and the communities producing coffee. Now, this has been a long time coming for me because I've known for a long time, and I really wanted to have her on the show. And I'm so honored to be talking with somebody who I consider to be one of the best thinkers in the coffee space and has contributed so greatly to the progress of coffee. Meister has worked in the coffee industry for over 20 years in a wide range of capacities. Primarily, she is a journalist, an educator, a communicator, and her work focuses on issues of access, equity, and ethics. She is also the author of New York City Coffee, A Caffeinated History, published by the History Press 2017, and the host of the coffee marketing podcast In Good Taste on the Sprudge Media Network. And in today's conversation, we are going to be discussing that article I mentioned, Buying Less and Doing More, and diving into all the complexities that surround how we develop our habits around green buying and the relationships between our roasteries and the producers that we are buying our coffee from. This is as much a philosophical conversation as it is a practical conversation as we talk about the realities on the ground in green buying and roasting, how we got to where we are, and how we can move forward to a model where we can actually affect positive change by changing the way that we purchase coffee and think about the relationships between us and the producers. We talk about communication, conflict resolution, compromise, and try to touch on all the questions you might have as you try to wrap your head around buying less and doing more in your roastery. So with that said, let's get right to it. Here now is my conversation with the author of the article, Buy Less, Do More, Meister. Welcome to Keys to the Shop. I'm really glad to have you on the show. How are you?
Doing pretty well. It's an honor to be here with you, Chris.
I was just telling you, I can't believe it's been this long of doing Keys to the Shop and I haven't had you on the show. So it feels like a long time coming.
Well, thank you. I feel like I had to earn the right to be invited.
Hardly. But we're going to be digging into some really cool stuff today on this Rate of Rise episode. You wrote a great article for Roast Magazine talking about buying less and doing more and addressing the topic of how, I guess, we have a tendency to purchase a lot of these small lots of coffee and from many different producers, kind of like a buffet, I guess, and how that might not be the best thing. And maybe we can make more impact the other way around. So as we start talking about this, I wonder to start, because you've had so much experience in the world of green coffee, like what would you say is the current state of green buying in terms of volume, specifically for specialty coffee?
Well, that's a great question. I think right now we have to look at the fact that everything is a little bit topsy-turvy, especially with the current shipping delays from the container shortage and various COVID-related delays. So people's buying in terms of volume and in terms of delivery is a little bit different now than I think it has been historically, or even has been over the past few years as a trend in specialty coffee. Anecdotally, we've I've spoken to some roasters who are having a little bit of trouble getting their forward contracts fulfilled right now, just in terms of, delays and things like that. So folks are having to scramble a little to buy spot coffee to fill in those gaps. But the demand for specialty coffee is still strong. It was somewhat surprising, actually, to see the types of coffees that roasters were still buying during the various pandemic lockdowns we've had in the US. Lots of importers seem to think that micro lots and high-end coffees and experimental lots would be the area of the market that suffered, because it'd be too much of a risk or too much of a gamble. But that's what people ended up wanting, because more and more folks were staying home and were sort of desperate to have something that would take the place of the coffee shop to add a little something special in their days. So in terms of volume, we sort of expected volumes to be down pretty significantly, especially over this past year coming into 2021. But in the first half of 2021, it looks like numbers are tracking up. People are finding alternative markets. So there isn't that same terror about who's going to buy this that I think folks had at the beginning of 2020 when things were really pretty uncertain. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely does. And
Great.
So given that the demand will, affect the lives of those producing it, I mean, who ends up benefiting from that trend, I guess, directly related to COVID right now? Is it the ones who are just the really small micro lots, or is it the ones who are producing are a little bit larger volume farms?
Well, that's interesting. I think one of the common misconceptions we have in the industry is that those are two different types of producers that you've just described, when realistically, most producers, especially those who have access to a specialty market, have a very small selection of their yield that tends to be very high end. And then they'll have kind of a larger bulked coffee that is usually sort of somewhere toward the middle 80s to the lower 80s, which is, just the way that agriculture sort of works. I always try to remind folks that there's no such thing as a specialty coffee producer. Just about every producer has the capacity to produce specialty coffee, but, there's not a line in the sand that says, okay, all the farmers over here are specialty only, and also I think, everything from 80 to 100, we have to remember, is also specialty. But I think that, there is a lot of opportunity for folks to really capitalize on those higher end coffees by charging more money for the value. But also I think it's a time where people are able to look at more holistic buying in terms of, well, I see your potential to create a certain percentage of really high-end coffees. That means that all of your coffee really has the potential to improve. Why don't we go in and find a use for the bulk of your output? We can, buy more of your total volume at a reasonable price or at a hierarchical price based on quality, and then, find a home for that on the other end. So theoretically, anybody could benefit from that sort of buying. The other kind of misconception, and I know you know this, Chris, is that the producers who produce a very small amount of very high quality coffee aren't necessarily making a lot of money on that lot just because the lot happens to be very highly priced. Creating those lots is exponentially more expensive for a producer in terms of both time and financial output. I hate to have the answer of it depends, but as with everything in coffee, it depends.
Yes. And so, I mean, it's just a matter of doing the work to actually find a home for those coffees. We actually talk about that in different places in specialty retail about, every coffee has a home, sort of like when the dark roast customers are maybe the ones that are most responsible for making our coffee shop profitable, and we don't want to admit it. Or the people that buy the low 80s coffees, but doing the work as a roaster to work with the farmers to actually procure that coffee seems to be lacking, and is kind of the point of this article in that, forgive the pun, but I love it, cherry picking the best from these farms and then letting them fend for themselves in the market, like almost closing off the market to them when it comes to the other coffees that are the bulk of what they might be producing. I mean, it feels like to me before the third wave progressive / modern coffee movement, we were doing more volume buying, like larger volumes of coffee from producers, and not just taking those cream of the crop coffees, and we were selling them to people in like the 90s coffee shops and 80s and things. How did we get as an industry to a place where we are buying from so little from so many different farmers who have more to offer, but we're just not interested? That's
a great question. I'll probably say that's a great question after every question. Which is a bad habit that lots of interview guests have, but I do mean it. One thing that I would say is that I think if we look historically to those larger volume buys, it's a little bit of it may be a little bit of a mistake to think that those buys were coming directly to producers. Those volume buys were really happening at the importer-exporter stage. So there was less differentiation between individual producers. I don't think that individual producers were really seeing a greater percentage of their volume being bought at a reasonable price. I think that is more of speaking to one step closer to the commercial market as specialty coffee was in the 90s, I think. Those relationships were really foundational between the roasters and their importer partners. And you can see that too if you look back at some of the old language. We can go over a history lesson of specialty coffee, right? And include the fair trade and the evolution of direct trade and how roasters have become more interested in the idea of developing a relationship, either an interpersonal relationship or more of an emotional relationship with a product and a producer. But specialty coffee is inherently pretty risky. And while the barriers to entry have been lifted for people to learn how to roast, there's still a lot of gatekeeping in terms of the knowledge for buying and sourcing coffees. There's also a lot of intimidation there because, especially as more and more people get into the actual physical act of roasting because they're buying equipment and taking classes to learn the process, they're still looking at the importer or the exporter as being the kind of knight in front of the kingdom, so to speak. And I think especially small companies, especially small roasters who are just starting, are going to naturally be risk averse however they possibly can. So buying spot coffee from an importer's menu or, off of a website, a small bag coffee, things like that, is necessary because, it seems like it's the perfect intersection of price and a sort of established cup quality. It's not as risky as building more direct relationships, and you have a little bit of a safeguard if you can trust your importer partner. Relationships and relationship buying, in my mind, it requires some degree of not just commitment to doing that business, but it does require some commitment to scale, if not presently, then in the future, in order to really make it a sustainable practice. So how, as an industry, did we get where we're buying from so many producers? I think it really has come down to the competition of the market, people really talking about differentiation being the key these days, third wave coffee being obsessed with micro regions and special processes and variety and things that were unheard of 15 years ago in the larger specialty market. But then also the intimidation of, well, if I put all my eggs in one basket, then my customers will be bored, or I won't stand out from the next person, or I have the potential of missing out on a particular coffee. So I think that there are lots of different reasons that we've gotten to this place of kind of smorgasbord buying. One of them is also a callback to, if I'm opening a specialty coffee shop, I have to have a Kenyan, a Colombian, a Papua New Guinea, something from Costa Rica, or my customers won't be happy, which I think is another kind of misconception that we've really hung on to as an industry culture. Does that land for you? Do you think that
Yeah.
feels true?
Well, I can't imagine that people are wringing their hands in their living rooms in a place where there's not Papua New Guinea, thinking, if only there was a Papua New Guinea here, and I'd go to this coffee shop. We create the market when we
Yes.
create the spreadsheet of offerings, and people just acquiesce to the things that we say. Where it's like, okay, well, it's not like these are just native-born desires in people to have a
Right.
Papua New Guinea pour over. So I feel like that you're absolutely nailing that, and the idea that competition of between shops is based on the I guess how specific the processes are in the regions, and getting it from a different farmer than the next coffee shop may be a little bit overstated how effective that is in actually bringing people into your shop and making you successful. I don't really see people saying looking at the coffees and saying, oh, they have a Colombia too. Meh.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And this idea of the expansive menu of options is a little bit like being a jack of all trades and master of none. It's overwhelming to everyone to have to, keep in mind all of these different flavor profiles or origins or stories. A little bit like being a sommelier when coffee just hasn't. I mean, it honestly just hasn't risen to that level for the average consumer, even the above average consumer.
Yeah. And I for some reason have gone back in my mind to Kitchen Nightmares episodes where they have like the pizza parlor that has, a 12 to 15 page menu of pizza options. It's just like, why are people not coming to my store? And why are people confused? Yeah, I mean, there is such a crazy amount of choices that we need to present to customers. And it seems like it's based on somewhat now on our own ego more than it is based on actual service to them or to the producers of the coffee itself. And so I guess that leads me to my next question, which is more like, what is it that happens as a result downstream or upstream, however you want to flip it, is what's the negative impact of having this smorgasbord style coffee buying habit?
First, I will preface my answer by saying there may be negative impact, but not every type of buying strategy is going to work for every business. There will always be the need for a spot business in the coffee trade. There just will be. Importers need people to buy many different types of coffee at the same time based on, the cupping notes and the price and the availability. But when we're thinking about the potential negative impact of everyone operating that way, we really have to consider the fact that, again, there's no such thing as a specialty coffee producer. There are producers of specialty coffee who also happen to have, a wide range of qualities and characteristics. And if we only take their 88 plus coffees, then we leave them holding the bag. We leave them with the responsibility of placing those coffees somewhere else. We leave them with the time and energy that it takes to negotiate a different price for what is essentially the bulk of their product. It continues to put the power in the importer and the exporter's hands. So they'll continue to make decisions based on what their customers need, right? So if the average roaster is buying based off of a spot menu, or even based on forward booking of more generic types of coffees without a producer, without a relationship assigned to them, then the people who are doing this bulk buying, the importers, are going to receive a lot less pressure into, building those long-term relationships for themselves. They'll continue to sort of scatter their purchases to capture the greatest number of that kind of common denominator customer who sort of checks all of those origin and quality grade boxes. It also kind of allows us to be complacent about the state of the worldwide market. And it makes it easier for us to think that we're doing a quote unquote good deed when we're really not doing anything at all that's beyond a transactional business. When you build your whole business on just buying spot without having a real relationship to the supply chain, without having a real relationship even with how your importer sources those coffees. You may think that you're doing a sort of ethical business, and this happens all the time because you trust your partners. But transactional business is what the commercial and the commodity market is built on. And if we want to call ourselves specialty, then we had better start acting special. And I really think that relationship coffee in a real sustainable, commitment on both sides kind of a way is the way to force us as a segment of the industry to start to act like what we're doing is a special kind of business.
I like that. Special kind of business, a special kind of commitment. And commitment seems to come up a lot in this discussion where if you imagine yourself looking at the importer spreadsheet and just clicking and filling your order runs and things like that, there's not a lot of commitment there outside of the idea of the commitment between the importer and the roaster. Mm-hmm. And so it does make invisible the hands behind the coffee, even though you might be really into the idea of representing those hands in that transaction. It almost undermines your efforts, is what I hear you saying.
Well, I think, the commitment to the importer level too is really significant. I really feel like a lot of roasters don't feel empowered to be asking their importer partner questions specifically about how certain coffees are bought, what those relationships are like, how those negotiation happens and when and with whom. I think that I would love to see roasters more empowered to start the conversations. It doesn't necessarily mean having to meet a producer, feel connected to them for life, send them a birthday card every year. I think there's levels of relationship that exist along any kind of successful business. And I think really getting to know your suppliers in a meaningful way, and then, that sort of forces them to get to know their suppliers in a meaningful way. So it's a stream, and I really do think that taking that ownership over our behavior, over the coffees that we buy, over even the transactional relationships that we have, really forces us to look at, am I doing something good here? Or am I just doing, the sort of status quo that continues coffee churning through my business? But is that what I want my business to stand for?
Right. You have power in the transaction itself by virtue of the fact that you hold the least risk. You talk in this article about the redistribution of risk in the supply chain. And that least amount of risk actually comes with more power. And so not discounting how your voice can sway what your importing partners do. From what you were saying earlier, if they get more pressure from people about, hey, what about this producer? I want to know more. Maybe you can buy more of this coffee than you're currently offering. Eventually, maybe not the next week, but sounds like that kind of thing would eventually change the format, change the structure so that it would allow for more coffees to be purchased from these farmers that are just having smaller lots of their coffees purchased by the importers.
Right. And I think, we talk about risk aversion and risk mitigation, and I really think one of the most overlooked ways to reduce risk is to develop a really close relationship with your importer. Because if you're interested in doing a more relational buying, if you're interested in doing more forward contracts that really do come with more risk in terms of quality, delivery, unforeseen events like the everyday for the past year and a half, quote unquote, unprecedented times. But if you have a good relationship with your importer and you can trust them to know what your business needs in and out, then if your coffee is delayed by a few weeks, they should be able to help you out. They should be able to help you find solutions for problems that come up. That's why importers exist. And I think a lot of people don't leverage those relationships because either they don't trust the importer enough to make those connections and sort of look out for them in that real, authentic way, in which case I would say, find a new partner, or they trust their importer too much and they say, well, I buy from XYZ, so I must be doing ethical coffee. And it's that's a really beautiful thought.
Mm-hmm.
But, there's a lot that goes into what our definitions of ethical buying might be. And your definition might not line up with what that importer is doing, even if you both believe that you're acting ethically. So I think it's really important for us to think critically in any kind of sourcing relationship. And I would love for roasters to feel more empowered to hold their importers to those critical standards. And they're not going to be the same for every roaster. And lots of roasters will find that the partners that they've been working with probably aren't the best fit, but that's part of the reason that the industry is so great. There's a new partner everywhere you turn. You just have to sort of shop around. Maybe shop around for the partners, not shop around for the Kenya and Papua New Guinea and Colombia.
Yeah. So let's dig into the idea of somebody who is listening and wants to and says, okay, that makes sense. Like I can see why me just making this very minimal commitment would kind of make it hard for the producer to really make it into the market with the rest of their coffees. I want to do my part to transfer the way that I purchase to be a little bit more towards the relational side and buy more from this one farm. What are the first steps that somebody should take in order to switch their way of purchasing to something that is a little bit more commitment oriented, relational oriented?
I'm taking a deep breath because it's a big answer. Well, I think the first thing to do is to accept the idea that if this isn't the way that you've been buying historically and you have an established business, it's probably not a great idea to throw out everything that you've done before and start fresh right now with, I'm only going to do relationship coffee from here on out.
Right.
Because this type of a transition does take some planning. It does take some calculation. It takes a lot of time and energy, and it takes a lot of self-evaluation. So you'd really want to sit down and think, okay, first of all, if say I'm going to replace one part of my menu with a relationship-based coffee, I would try and do my calculations based on my inventory and performance over the past few years to see what the volume is that I need, what the quality is that I need, and the price. That's the most basic, right? That's what you would do anytime you were looking to replace a coffee on your menu. Then I would probably also look at why I wanted this particular transition in the way that I do business. What are my goals? What are my values? Do I expect to grow with a producer? Is this more of something that I want to do because it's a belief that I have in sustainability? Is it because other people are doing it and I think that it's cool? Is it, is there a marketing component here? What are my core values as a business? And then that will help you find the right partners in terms of if you want to partner with a producer who expects to invest in their farm and would like to expand the amount of business that they do with you. It also helps you know if you find that right person, can you think creatively about how to accept more of their volume in your buying rather than, and sort of replace some of the other products that you have. For instance, if you go in looking for a relationship for a single origin offering, you want something that's kind of on the specialer side with 87, 88 points, but that producer also has a lot of 84s and 85s. Can you buy both their top tier lots and their slightly lower tier lots, use the lower tier lots in a blend? Can you find a versatile use for that relationship? You're going to want to make sure that you have a 3-year, 5-year, 10-year plan, depending on the longevity of the project that you're looking at and the business that you're operating. Do you expect to grow in a way that can match this producer and your expectations, or will you need to supplement this relationship with others if you grow faster than the farm does, for instance? You also want to make sure that you really communicate with the people who are conducting this business for you in a practical sense, that they know what your expectations are. So if you don't have a strong relationship with the folks that you're actually doing signing the contracts through and organizing shipments with, you're either going to want to develop that close relationship, or you're going to want to find someone that you can have a close relationship with, because you're going to need someone to kind of help you navigate that water, especially if you're just starting out, or if you're on the smaller side, or you've been doing purely spot buys, because it's a little bit of a different language and a little bit of a different set of expectations to have. And you also want to think and strategize a plan for if it doesn't work out. We're human beings dealing with human beings, dealing with agriculture, which also sometimes doesn't play by human rules. So you want to have an exit strategy. Both parties should have an exit strategy. The producer might also just decide, this isn't working out for me, or you're not negotiating with me in a way that is appropriate, or maybe they sever their relationship with the importer. So you just kind of have to think through all scenarios, which is a daunting task for a small or a young roaster. But again, that's why there are these other entities in the supply stream who should be able to help you know which questions to ask and find a way to answer them for your unique business.
I'm glad you brought that up too. I mean, all that you're saying is so practical, and it really is. It forces you to do the work of forecasting and doing your due diligence to, like, say, 5-year, 10-year plan. I think a lot of roasters might not even be thinking that far ahead in general of, what's going to happen 5 to 10 years from now. They're just trying to make it this year, And so it would probably benefit your business in lots of other ways to, take this on. But when we're redistributing the risk and taking on the risk ourselves. Now, I think producers are kind of used to taking on a lot of risk because that's kind of their life. I don't know how much risk we're used to taking on. And in the event that we're wanting to pursue relationship coffees like this and make commitments to farmers in the environment where I think a lot more roasters are really concerned about the well-being of those who are making their coffee possible, it could be really hard to sever the relationship on your end. When you've made a commitment, because it would feel as though you are, I don't want to say trapped by your ethics, but there's a tension between the ethics and the practicality of business that I don't know a lot of people are used to dealing with because they're separated from that risk. I wonder if you might speak to maybe how somebody could, deal with that kind of tension, if that makes sense. Like, I don't want to be the bad guy here, and say, no, we can't buy from this farm anymore, knowing that now they have to find somewhere else to sell their coffee. It would make me feel like a complete, heel for doing that. And I've never used the word heel, but
it's sort of a question about, why would you sever that kind of a relationship, and what can we sort of set up before the relationship is even established in order to sort of protect against that happening. The thing that comes into this is recognizing that coffee roasters are human beings for right now. They're human beings. And the reasons that roasters might back out of a relationship range from everything from, a Seinfeld-like excuse to get out of a second date, all the way to serious issues with quality, delivery, interpersonal conflicts that do come up sometimes. Getting outpriced by somebody else can sometimes come up. I think one thing that roasters can really do to mitigate some of that tension that you mentioned is to expect that their expectations for coffees that are based in a relationship might be different from the coffees that they're buying spot. Because when you buy coffees from a spot menu based on a set of parameters that are preset with your intersection of price, quality, and volume, then it doesn't really matter what coffees fill that need for you as long as you're hitting those 3 targets. But now we're trying to fit a relationship into those 3 targets. And, at one time or another, you may have to make some compromise, as within any great relationship. I mean, you're thinking about a real relationship, right? Anybody can be in a relationship if all you want is to be partnered with somebody. If you want to be in a good relationship, what are the key things, right? You have to communicate, you have to be honest, you have to be able to compromise, and you have to be able to work together to resolve conflict. All of those things are still true, even if it's a business relationship. Communication is probably the number one thing that roasters can do to ensure that that risk is a little bit mitigated. And that not only just communication among the partners in that supply, but also internally. You have to talk to yourself about, what am I willing to accept? And if there's a certain thing that I'm not willing to accept, how do I justify backing out of this relationship on behalf of that expectation?
That makes a lot of sense. I like the way you put that. Thank
you. You know, you sort of think about the big thing about relationship buying, right? That commitment that we're talking about is long term. How are we going to work together year after year? One of the things that roasters worry about the most is, what if the coffee is scoring lower next year? We obsess about this idea of the quality is going to dip. And when we talk about quality dipping, we usually mean 3 points? I mean, it's pretty rare that a coffee would significantly fall off unless something horrible happened. Your customers, honestly, from year to year, are not going to taste this coffee and go, last year this was 2 points higher. They just don't have that kind of relationship with the product. They come to trust you and your quality. I will say that a difference of 3 to 4 points to an average, even an above average customer, is not going to ruin your business, especially if it's only one relationship, and especially if it's due to agricultural or political or logistic things that are outside of your control. So many roasters back out of these types of relationships because a producer's quality goes down. It's an agricultural product. Things operate based on elements outside of the producer's control, the weather, the, political climate in their country, the flow of money to the producer, all of these things that often the producer has the least say in. That's where the risk comes in. That's what we're trying to mitigate for the producer, right? Mm-hmm. And it's actually not that great a risk for the roaster if they're really willing to say, I'm going to make this work. Like, I am committed to this. It's just, we, like you said before, we create those expectations for our customers. Our customers are not sitting there with their archive of cupping notes from our coffees and saying, the vintage on the 2019 Finca El Injerto was so much better than this one. What happened? They're not interacting with coffee that way. The ones who are interacting with coffee that way are frankly so annoying. I don't know if we want to build our industry based on trying to please them. I really think that if we're looking sustainably, I don't think that in terms of the quality, if you make the right partnership, I don't think that the quality compromise should be as big a risk as we often make it out to be in our minds.
Right. It's interesting as you talk about that, because I was thinking about, there is this one customer that probably does that in every shop or whatever. Mm-hmm. They've got the spreadsheet. But you were talking about, I'm committed to this, back to commitment, and how in our ecosystem of retail, we want people to be committed to us through our ups and downs. Brand loyalty, we talk about it all the time. We want people to give us grace for our foibles and whatever else happens. And it seems like there's this, we're allergic to it in the other direction, but it makes sense, even more sense actually, that direction, right? And if you're not pleased with the coffee, I mean, maybe it's just, a production error. Maybe it's your barista. There's a lot of ways that you can, even if it's 2 points lower, like glam up the a coffee on your end. But yeah, that commitment does make sense that it would work both directions in the value stream.
Yes, and we also forget that roasters are the value-added element of the supply stream. If the value isn't there in the raw product, you have the opportunity to add it when you roast the coffee. That doesn't necessarily mean that you can make a decent coffee exceptional in the roaster, but it does mean that you can use your influence over that raw product to make something that creates a unique experience. That's where that versatility comes into play. If the coffee doesn't show up this year the same way it showed up last year, then don't use it the way that you used it last year. You can make a blend by roasting the same coffee 2 different ways, offering your customers a new relationship with that particular coffee, and finding a way to make the coffee a really exceptional product. We just don't necessarily think as resourcefully about trying to make these types of coffees work for us. We would rather try to, mash it into our ideal of, well, this is going to be great. Every year I'm going to get better and better coffee, and every year the relationship's going to get stronger and stronger. Relationships don't just happen. It's an active verb, to really form a relationship and sustain it with anybody. And, it's also really important for us to look at, if you're buying 5 bags of coffee from a producer who produces 100, your expectations need to be in line with what you're offering to that producer as benefit, as part of their catalog of business relationships. You can't say to that producer, this coffee is 1 point lower than I expected. It's like, you're 5 bags. You have to be realistic about your own position in that producer's life and work.
You're that wholesale account to that farmer.
Yeah. Or you're that customer to that farmer.
Yeah, this is a mindset shift for sure. And going into it in a competitive market, now especially, back to the idea of what COVID has produced, we were talking about that in the world of farming and green purchasing. But in the market of selling roasted coffee, there's the explosion of home barista, and online subscriptions have grown. And I know lots of people are opening roasteries and coffee shops now, especially getting into the game and starting to expand again now that things are, quote unquote, more normal. Remaining competitive with this type of relational coffee where people are in the same city as others who have this high rotation of really esoteric processed coffees, and it's just super shiny, super new all the time, and it makes people feel like, oh, I guess I'm not that cool kid on the block anymore. How do you suggest people really get over that? We've touched on it a little bit here, but I wonder if there's some other ways that people can not just utilize the coffee by feeling like, oh, I just got to hide this coffee in a blend. How do we actually celebrate it and do it in a way that benefits our business?
Well, that's a very good question. There I go again. I really do think that there is, a genuineness to the story of a relationship that happens only when there's a genuineness to the relationship itself. Anybody can copy and paste some specs about a farm off of an importer's website and regurgitate the story that they tell. But when you get to know a coffee, and that doesn't necessarily mean getting to know the producer, but when you get to know a coffee because you work with it year in and year out, or because you know more about how it comes to you, you know more about the risk involved because you've taken some of that on, that gives you the added marketing advantage of building trust with your customers. That is what we're really looking for. I don't think, speaking myself as a consumer as well, I would say when I go into the coffee shop I go into all the time, even if they had a different single origin coffee on the menu every week or every month, I probably wouldn't unless it was a truly astounding coffee. And those just don't happen that often. I wouldn't develop such a relationship with that individual coffee as I would with the roaster or the coffee shop itself. I don't think that we should expect consumers to have as close a relationship to the product as we do. I think consumers choose where they buy coffee because of the feeling that that brand evokes from them. If that wasn't true, then our brands wouldn't try so hard to differentiate from one another. Our businesses wouldn't try so hard to differentiate from one another. I don't think that the consumer that's keeping the lights on is not bouncing around from roaster to roaster or from shop to shop looking for the next great coffee to get excited over. They show up to the same shop and they are like, well, what's new? Or what's not new? What's the thing that I love that is always on the menu? I really do think we have an unrealistic expectation for this idea of competition that needs to be more our responsibility than the producer's responsibility or even the coffee's responsibility. It's like, what do you want consumers to be drawn to about your brand? Is it your aesthetic? Is it the kind of way that the language that you use makes them feel? Is it the relationships that you build with your partners? Is it a very clear ethical or moral compass that your whole brand imbues? Like, what is it that makes people come back? I guarantee you it's not because you buy from one farm 2 months out of every year. I just don't think that consumers are operating on that level. So the competition of the guy down the street has a different farm every week. Like, well, good for the guy down the street. I wouldn't want to work in his inventory. I wouldn't want to be having to manage all those different bags, So, I mean, I don't know. I think that there's lots of different ways to looking at it. Again, like, I hate to generalize. Everybody has a different idea of what excites them about coffee. For some people, it's a new thing every week, a new exciting relationship, or even not a relationship, just a flavor experience. That's cool. Keep doing what you're doing. But, if you're at a point in your business when you're like, coffee is great and coffee tastes great and it excites me, but I'm looking for something more. I'm looking for a way to contribute to the ongoing sustainability of this industry in a way that touches a little bit closer to the farm level. That's what we're sort of talking about. Again, it's not for everybody, and that's cool. We don't need it to be for everybody, but I do think that there is a little bit of a push on both ends of the supply stream to maybe increase the amount of roasters that are thinking that way. And let's find practical, lasting, meaningful pathways to get those people there. But, if that's not your thing, it's not your thing. That's cool. It takes all kinds.
You've done such a good job with the article, and here in this interview too. I think you've just been masterful at sort of creating the paradigm that we can enter into, and giving us some practical steps to contribute, like you said, to the ongoing sustainability of coffee. It actually makes sense, especially with this last comment that you're making about competition. It makes sense that for the sustainability of our business too. Because of people's trust in us as a brand and their commitment to us and our commitment to the producers. And it's just a virtuous cycle. And this has really been a fantastic conversation. How can people stay in touch with you? You're just a fount of knowledge, obviously, in this thing. So how can people stay in touch with you?
Well, I'm always around to talk about coffee, literally always. So it is the thing I think about 24 hours a day. So if anybody ever has any questions, or, I'm not the expert on this type of thing, but I've done a lot of thinking, a lot of talking, and a lot of collaborating with roasters who are trying to move in this direction. And obviously I worked in green for a while. So I'd be happy to answer any questions and even just point folks in the right direction to other people that they can talk to get a practical start. So feel free to email. I'm Meister@justmeister.com. You can follow me on Instagram @justmeister. I'm pretty easy to find because I just hang around in coffee spaces. I don't do much else, I guess.
Well, I really appreciate you hanging around with us today. It's really been a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. I've had a really good time. I hope that I made any sense at all.
All the sense in the world.
Thank you.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. We could have talked much, much longer about these subjects, but one of the main takeaways for me was the idea of commitment and working together to evolve over time to become better and stick with somebody in the ups and the downs. Like we were talking about here, just like we would want customers to give us grace in our retail expressions, the same should go from us to those who are producing our coffee. And the separation between us often makes it easier to not extend that grace. This conversation, I think, puts in practical terms how to step forward in your roastery to bring about this new way of thinking and doing green buying and relationships in the coffee industry. And I can't thank Meister enough for joining us on the show. It was so great to have you. If you want to reach out to Ever, you can just email her. The email is Meister, Meister, at justmeister.com. Now don't forget that you can listen to this audio article over at roastmagazine.com/audio articles. And also, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback from me about this episode or any of the other episodes on Keys to the Shop, you can reach me by emailing chris@keystotheshop.com. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining in on this show. I appreciate you all. And as always, I hope that this episode has given you keys to the shop.